Some inheritances break your heart before they break your back. When 6-year-old Daisy Thompson lost her mother, the last thing she needed was a falling-down cabin that everyone called worthless. The old building sat on 30 acres of forgotten farmland, its roof sagging and walls barely standing. Her relatives shook their heads at the reading of the will. The neighbors whispered in pity about the burden placed on such small shoulders. Even the town banker suggested she sell the land, for whatever few dollars it might bring. Everyone agreed the child had been left with nothing but trouble. But beneath those rotting floorboards lay something that would change everything. A secret worth $200 million waited in the shadows of that crumbling cabin. The whole town had written off little Daisy and her inheritance. They had no idea what was really hidden on that forgotten piece of land. But how could a 6-year-old girl possibly uncover such an extraordinary treasure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The town of Millfield had seen better days, much like the weathered faces of the folks who called it home. Nestled in a valley where the morning mist clung to rolling hills like memories refusing to fade, this farming community had once thrived on corn and cattle. Now, with family farms giving way to corporate agriculture and young people heading to bigger cities, Millfield felt like a photograph, slowly losing its color. Main Street stretched for barely 6 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had stood since the 1920s. Thompson's Hardware still occupied the corner, though old Pete Thompson, Daisy's great-uncle, had long since stopped keeping regular hours. The Millfield diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie that could make a grown man weep with nostalgia. Mrs. Carson's flower shop added splashes of color to otherwise fading storefronts, while the First National Bank of Millfield stood as solid and dependable as the day it opened, even if it now served a fraction of its former customers. The courthouse square featured a monument to local boys who never came home from various wars, and beneath the old oak trees, park benches held the weight of countless conversations about weather, crops, and the way things used to be. This was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where news traveled faster than wildfire, and where a 6-year-old girl inheriting a falling-down cabin became the subject of every coffee shop conversation for weeks. Daisy May Thompson had lived her entire short life in a small rental house on Elm Street with her mother Sarah. The white clapboard house with its green shutters had been their sanctuary, filled with the scent of her mother's homemade bread and the sound of laughter that seemed to make even the shabbiest furniture feel like luxury. Sarah Thompson had possessed that rare gift of making something beautiful from almost nothing, turning mason jars into flower vases, transforming thrift store finds into treasures, and creating a home that felt rich in everything that truly mattered. Sarah had worked 3 jobs to keep their little household running. Mornings at the diner, flipping pancakes and pouring coffee, afternoons cleaning houses for the wealthier families on the hill, and evenings taking in sewing that she completed by lamplight after Daisy had gone to bed. Despite the long hours, she always made time for bedtime stories, Sunday afternoon walks, and the kind of unhurried conversations that made Daisy feel like the most important person in the world. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah collapsed while making Daisy's breakfast, and by the time the paramedics arrived, she was already gone. At 32, she left behind a daughter who suddenly found herself alone in a world that seemed far too big and complicated for such small shoulders to bear. The funeral filled the Methodist Church to capacity, a testament to how many lives Sarah had touched during her brief time in Millfield. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who lived next door, held Daisy's hand throughout the service, her own eyes red with grief for the young mother she'd come to love like a daughter. The whole town mourned, not just for Sarah, but for the little girl who now faced an uncertain future. The reading of the will took place in the cramped office above Peterson's insurance agency, where lawyer Harold Winters had practiced for 43 years. The attendees filled the small waiting room to capacity. Daisy's Uncle Robert, Sarah's older brother who lived 2 counties over, his wife Margaret, their teenage son Tommy, and Mrs. Henderson, who had somehow become Daisy's unofficial guardian. In the weeks since Sarah's passing, Harold Winters adjusted his thick glasses and cleared his throat before opening the manila folder that contained Sarah's final wishes. The will was simple, handwritten on legal paper in Sarah's careful script. To her daughter Daisy Mae Thompson, she left her personal belongings, a savings account containing 840 svenlos, and, surprisingly to everyone in the room, the old cabin, and 30 acres of farmland that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. A cabin? Uncle Robert's voice carried a mixture of surprise and irritation. What cabin? I never heard Mother mention any cabin. Harold consulted his notes. According to the deed, it's located on rural Route 7, approximately 12 miles northeast of town. The property has been in the family since 1923, though I understand it hasn't been occupied for many years. Margaret Thompson, a thin woman with pursed lips and calculating eyes, shook her head disapprovingly. What's a 6-year-old supposed to do with an old cabin? The child needs practical things, not some falling down building in the middle of nowhere. Mrs. Henderson squeezed Daisy's hand gently. The older woman had silver hair that she wore in a soft bun, kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the sort of grandmotherly presence that made children want to confide their secrets. Perhaps we should take a look at the property before making any decisions, she suggested quietly. From the depths of the lawyer's desk drawer came a small envelope containing a single brass key, tarnished with age and attached to a piece of twine. Harold handed it to Daisy with the solemnity of someone passing along a sacred trust. The key felt surprisingly heavy in her small palm, warm from the lawyer's touch, and somehow significant in a way she couldn't yet understand. After the legal formalities, Uncle Robert took Daisy aside with the awkward manner of a man unaccustomed to dealing with children. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, crouching down to her level, but still managing to sound distant. "You're going to come live with us now. We'll take care of everything, including this cabin business. Might be best to sell it and put the money aside for your education." But it was Mrs. Henderson who drove Daisy out to see the property that afternoon. The older woman had insisted, over the Thompsons' mild protests, that the child should at least see what she'd inherited before any decisions were made. They took the winding country road that led through farmland dotted with cattle and the occasional farmhouse, past fields that were just beginning to show the first green shoots of spring. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering oak and maple trees, their branches forming a natural cathedral overhead. At first glance, it looked like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. The log walls, once golden brown, had weathered to a silvery grey. The metal roof sagged in the middle, and several shingles lay scattered around the foundation like fallen leaves. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall, creating a green tapestry that both beautified and slowly destroyed the underlying structure. "Oh my," Mrs. Henderson breathed, stepping carefully over broken boards on the front porch. It's been neglected for quite some time, but Daisy saw something different. Where others might see decay, she glimpsed possibility. The cabin had 2 main rooms connected by a wide archway, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Afternoon, sunlight streamed through dusty windows, creating golden rectangles on the rough-hewn wooden floors. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and something else, something that reminded her faintly of her mother's jewelry box, a sweet, mysterious scent that seemed to whisper of secrets. In the back room, partially hidden beneath years of accumulated leaves that had blown through a broken window, Daisy found a small wooden chest. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, lay her mother's locket, the same heart-shaped pendant Sarah had worn every day until the week before she died. Daisy had wondered what happened to it, and finding it here felt like receiving a message from beyond. The locket was tarnished silver, with an intricate engraving of roses around the edges. Inside, behind a cracked crystal, was a faded photograph of a man Daisy didn't recognize, handsome, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back of the locket, in tiny script, were the words, "All treasures hidden shall be revealed." Mrs. Henderson found Daisy clutching the locket, tears streaming down her small face. "She must have left it here for you to find," the older woman said softly, wrapping her arms around the child. "Your mother always was thoughtful that way." As they prepared to leave, Daisy took one last look around the cabin. Despite its obvious decay, something about this place felt important, felt right in a way she couldn't explain. The afternoon light slanting through the trees gave the clearing an almost magical quality, and she found herself wondering about all the people who had lived here before, all the stories these walls could tell. On the drive back to town, Mrs. Henderson was unusually quiet. Finally she spoke. "Your Uncle Robert means well, but sometimes adults get so focused on practical matters that they forget about the heart of things. That cabin, it's part of your family history, part of who you are. Whatever you decide to do with it, make sure it's your decision, not someone else's." That evening, staying temporarily with Mrs. Henderson while the adults sorted out the permanent arrangements, Daisy lay in the spare bedroom, examining her mother's locket by lamplight. The mysterious photograph seemed to look back at her with eyes that held secrets, and the engraved words on the back felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Outside her window, the lights of Millfield twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, an old cabin waited patiently for its new owner to discover what it truly held. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daisy found herself caught between two worlds: the cramped apartment above Uncle Robert's auto repair shop, where she was expected to live, and the pull of the cabin that seemed to call to her like a voice in the wind. The Thompsons meant well enough, but their small living space felt suffocating after the freedom she'd known with her mother. Margaret's attempts at mothering came in the form of rigid schedules and constant reminders about the burden Daisy's presence placed on their already stretched finances. "The child needs structure," Margaret would say to Robert when she thought. Daisy couldn't hear. "And that ridiculous fixation on the cabin has got to stop. It's not healthy for someone her age to be dwelling on the past." But Daisy's thoughts returned to the cabin like a compass needle seeking true north. There was something about that place, something beyond the locket she'd found, that made her feel closer to her mother than anywhere else. The mysterious photograph in the locket haunted her dreams, and the engraved words seemed to whisper possibilities she couldn't yet understand. On a particularly grey Thursday afternoon, when Margaret was at her weekly church meeting and Robert was buried under the hood of a broken-down Ford, Daisy slipped away. She'd memorized the route to the cabin during that first visit with Mrs. Henderson, and though it meant a long walk through the countryside, her determination proved stronger than her small legs' protests. The April sky promised rain, with clouds gathering like bruises overhead and the wind carrying the scent of approaching storms. By the time Daisy reached the cabin, the first fat drops were spattering against the dusty windows. She used the brass key, which she'd kept hidden in her pocket despite Margaret's suggestions that it should be locked away for safekeeping, and pushed open the front door just as the heavens opened in earnest. Inside, the cabin felt different during the storm. Rain drummed against the metal roof with increasing intensity, creating a rhythmic symphony that seemed to awaken something dormant in the old walls. The air felt charged, electric, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Daisy settled cross-legged on the dusty floor near the fireplace, listening to the storm and studying her mother's locket by the grey light filtering through rain-streaked windows. The photograph inside remained stubbornly mysterious. The man's face was kind but unfamiliar, and no amount of staring revealed his identity. But the words on the back, "All treasures hidden shall be revealed," seemed to pulse with meaning in the stormy twilight. Her mother had been many things, but she was never one for empty sentiment. Every gift, every gesture had purpose. As the storm intensified, a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, and Daisy instinctively scrambled toward what seemed like the most secure corner of the room. But as she pressed her small body against the floor, she felt something unexpected. A slight give in the wooden planks beneath her knees, as if one of the floorboards was loose. Curious now, she pressed harder and heard a subtle creaking sound. That was different from the normal settling of old wood. Running her fingers along the edges of the plank, she discovered that it wasn't nailed down like its neighbors. Instead, it seemed to be held in place by nothing more than gravity and decades of undisturbed dust. With the determination that only children possess when they've stumbled onto a mystery, Daisy worked her small fingers into the gap between the loose board and its neighbors. The wood was old and weathered, and after several minutes of patient prying, the board lifted free with a soft scraping sound that was nearly lost beneath the storm's fury. Beneath the floorboard lay a small rectangular cavity clearly carved deliberately into the supporting beam. And within that cavity, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, lay something that made Daisy's heart skip with excitement. Her hands trembled as she carefully lifted the package from its hiding place. The oiled cloth was old, but had done its job. Whatever lay inside felt dry, despite decades of concealment. She unwrapped the bundle with the reverence of someone opening a sacred text, and what she found made her gasp aloud. It was a map, hand-drawn on what looked like expensive parchment. The map showed intricate details of the land surrounding the cabin. But this wasn't just any ordinary map. It was clearly old, with brown ink that had faded to sepia, and careful notations written in a flowing script that spoke of another era. The cabin was marked with a small square in the center, and from there, a series of symbols and landmarks created a path that wound through the surrounding forest. Most intriguingly, several locations were marked with small X's, and beside each X was a notation in the same careful handwriting. Grandfather's Oak, 3 Stone Crossing, Devil's Hollow, and at the end of the trail, marked with a larger X and surrounded by what appeared to be decorative flourishes, were the words, "The heart of the matter." Daisy's own heart hammered with excitement as she studied the map by the stormy light. This was it. This was what her mother's locket had been hinting at. All treasures hidden shall be revealed. Her mother had known about this map, had probably left the locket in the cabin to guide Daisy to this very discovery. But as she examined the map more closely, she realized that following it would be no simple task. The landmarks were described in relation to natural features, rock formations, distinctive trees, water sources, rather than modern references. Some of the symbols were clearly navigational, though she wasn't sure how to read them. And the scale of the map suggested that the trail it depicted covered considerable ground, far more than she could explore in a single afternoon. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and lightning illuminated the cabin interior in stark, dramatic bursts. In those brief, brilliant moments, the map seemed to come alive in her hands, its carefully drawn features pulsing with possibility. Whatever her ancestors had hidden out there in the forest, whatever secret had been passed down through generations of her family, she was now the keeper of its location. As the storm began to subside, Daisy carefully rewrapped the map in its oiled cloth protective covering. But rather than returning it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, she tucked it inside her jacket, close to her heart. Some instinct told her that this discovery was meant for her alone, that the timing of finding it during this particular storm was no accident. The walk back to Uncle Robert's house gave her time to think, time to plan. She couldn't simply announce her discovery. Adults had a way of taking over things that children found, of making decisions about what was best without considering what might be right. Margaret would undoubtedly declare the map some sort of child's fantasy, while Robert would probably see it as another reason to sell the property quickly before Daisy got too attached to it. No, this secret would have to remain hers alone, at least until she understood what it meant. The map represented more than just the possibility of hidden treasure. It was a connection to her family's history, a link to ancestors she'd never known, but who had trusted future generations enough to leave behind this carefully preserved guide to whatever they deemed worth hiding. By the time she slipped back into the Thompson house, Daisy had made her decision. The map would stay with her, and somehow, some way, she would follow its trail to discover what lay waiting at the heart of the matter. Her mother's locket had led her to this moment, and she owed it to Sarah's memory and to her own curious, determined spirit to see where the adventure might lead. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the Thompsons' spare room, Daisy studied the locket by flashlight while the house settled into sleep around her. The mysterious man in the photograph seemed to smile encouragingly, as if he approved of her discovery and her decision to pursue it. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, she knew that an old cabin held more secrets than anyone could imagine, secrets that were now hers to unlock. The days following Daisy's discovery of the map passed in a blur of barely contained excitement and careful planning. Living with the Thompsons required a delicate balance, appearing to accept their authority while secretly nurturing her own agenda. Margaret had enrolled her in the local elementary school, where she sat through lessons on multiplication tables and state capitals, while her mind wandered to mysterious landmarks and hidden treasures. During recess, while other children played on swings and seesaws, Daisy would retreat to a quiet corner of the playground with a notebook, carefully copying the map's details from memory. She'd become skilled at recreating the flowing script and intricate symbols, and each reproduction helped her memorize more of the landmarks and their relationships to each other. The first breakthrough came during a particularly boring Saturday afternoon when Margaret had gone grocery shopping and Robert was working in his garage. Daisy had claimed to be reading in her room, but instead she'd been studying the map by window light, trying to match its symbols with the basic compass directions she'd learned in school. That's when she remembered something from her earlier visit to the cabin, a small wooden drawer built into the wall beside the fireplace that she hadn't thought to explore fully. If her family had hidden a map beneath the floorboards, what other secrets might be tucked away in the cabin's less obvious spaces? The walk to the cabin was becoming familiar now, though she'd learned to vary her route to avoid attracting attention from neighbors who might mention her frequent disappearances to the Thompsons. Today, she approached from the south, following a deer path through the woods that brought her to the clearing from an angle that couldn't be seen from the main road. Inside the cabin, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight as Daisy went directly to the wooden drawer beside the fireplace. It was old and warped, requiring considerable effort for her small hands to pull it open, but persistence finally rewarded her with a soft scraping sound as it yielded to her efforts. Inside, beneath, a layer of dust and what appeared to be fragments of old newspaper, her fingers encountered something smooth and cool. She lifted it carefully into the light and found herself holding an antique brass compass, its face yellowed with age, but its needle still responsive to magnetic north. The case was engraved with the same flowing script she'd seen on the map. True direction always finds its way. E.T. 1923. E.T. The initials matched the date on the property deed. This compass had belonged to her great-great-grandfather, Ezra Thompson, the man who had originally settled this land, and now it had found its way into her hands, just as she needed it most. Comparing the compass with the map's directional indicators, Daisy felt a thrill of recognition. The symbols she'd been puzzling over weren't just decorative, they were navigational markers designed to be read in conjunction with a compass. What had seemed like an impossible puzzle suddenly began to make sense. The map showed the cabin as the starting point, with a clear path leading northwest toward the first landmark, Grandfather's Oak. According to the compass and the map's notations, it lay approximately a quarter-mile from the cabin, near what appeared to be a small stream or creek. Armed with both the map and compass, Daisy set out on her first real expedition into the surrounding forest. The woods around the cabin were older than she'd initially realized, with towering trees that had clearly been growing for decades. Some of the oaks were massive, their trunks so wide that it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. Following the compass northwest, she picked her way through undergrowth that showed little sign of human passage. After about 10 minutes of careful walking, she heard the sound of running water, the creek indicated on the map. And there, standing sentinel beside the stream, was an oak tree so enormous and ancient that it seemed to command respect from all. The smaller trees around it, this had to be grandfather's oak. The tree was easily 5 feet in diameter, with a hollow at its base large enough for a child to climb inside. Its massive branches stretched out like protective arms, and carved into the bark about 4 feet up, weathered but still visible, was the letter T inside a rough circle. Daisy's heart raced as she realized she was standing at the first official landmark on her family's treasure map. The carved initial confirmed what she'd already suspected. This trail had been marked by her ancestors, left for future generations to follow. She wasn't just wandering randomly through the forest. She was retracing steps taken by family members who had walked this same path decades before she was born. According to the map, the next landmark lay northeast of Grandfather's Oak, across the creek, and up a gradual slope toward what was marked as 3 Stone Crossing. But by now the afternoon was growing late, and she knew she needed to return to the Thompson house before her absence was discovered. The walk back to the cabin gave her time to process what she'd accomplished. She'd successfully used the compass to navigate to the first landmark, confirming that the map was both accurate and still relevant despite its age. More importantly, she'd proven to herself that following this trail was not only possible but potentially rewarding in ways she was only beginning to imagine. Back at the cabin, she carefully returned the compass to its drawer, though something told her she'd be needing it again soon. The map went back inside her jacket, its presence both comforting and exciting against her ribs. She was no longer just a 6-year-old girl with a mysterious inheritance. She was an explorer, following in the footsteps of her ancestors, pursuing a mystery that had been waiting patiently for her to discover it. That evening, during a quiet dinner at the Thompson house, Uncle Robert mentioned that he'd been in contact with a man interested in purchasing the cabin property. "Fellow says he's looking for rural land to develop," Robert explained, not noticing how Daisy's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Might be willing to make a decent offer, especially if we're motivated to sell quickly." Margaret nodded approvingly. "It would certainly solve a lot of problems. The child doesn't need to be burdened with property maintenance, and the money could be put aside for her college fund." Daisy kept her expression carefully neutral, but inside she felt a surge of panic. They were talking about selling her cabin, her map's starting point, her connection to whatever treasure her family had hidden. She needed to move faster, to follow the trail to its conclusion, before the adults made decisions that would cut her off from her inheritance forever. "How long before he wants an answer?" she asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperate. Robert shrugged. "Few weeks, maybe a month. No rush, but he seemed pretty eager." A month. She had a month to solve a mystery that had been waiting nearly a century for resolution. It would have to be enough. The urgency of Uncle Robert's news about the potential buyer transformed Daisy's treasure hunting from an exciting adventure into a race against time. Over the next few days, she found herself studying the map with new intensity during every stolen moment, while Margaret prepared dinner, while Robert worked on cars in the garage during the quiet hours before dawn when the Thompson household still slept. Her second expedition to follow the map's trail came the following Wednesday afternoon. School had ended early due to a teacher training day, giving her several precious hours before the Thompsons expected her home. This time, she came prepared with a small backpack containing water, crackers, and a flashlight, approaching the treasure hunt with the seriousness of someone who understood that time was not on her side. Starting from Grandfather's Oak, she used The compass to navigate northeast toward the second landmark, 3 Stone Crossing. The terrain grew more challenging as she moved away from the creek, with the ground rising steadily through dense forest that filtered the afternoon sunlight into green-tinged shadows. According to the map, she needed to travel approximately half a mile from the oak tree, watching for a formation of 3 large stones that marked what appeared to be an intersection of 2 trails. 20 minutes of careful hiking brought her to a clearing where 3 massive granite boulders formed a rough triangle around what had once clearly been a well-traveled path. The stones were each taller than Daisy herself, weathered smooth by decades of wind and rain, and carved into the face of the largest boulder was the same T inside a circle that she'd found at Grandfather's oak. But standing in the clearing, studying the map more carefully, Daisy realized something that made her stomach clench with worry. The 3 stones marked not just a landmark, but also the edge of what the map indicated as Thompson family property. Beyond this point, the trail continued into forest that belonged to other landowners, property where she had no legal right to explore. Worse still, consulting the compass and map together revealed that the trail from 3 Stone Crossing led almost directly east for nearly a mile before reaching the next landmark, Devil's Hollow. That was a significant distance to cover on foot, through unfamiliar territory that might be posted against trespassing. But the most troubling discovery came when she noticed small wooden stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals along what appeared to be the eastern border of the Thompson property. The stakes were relatively new, their bright orange plastic tags fluttering like warning flags in the breeze. Someone had been surveying this land recently, and the survey line extended much farther north than she'd expected, based on the legal description she'd heard at the will reading. Following the survey stakes northward, Daisy discovered that the Thompson property was considerably larger than anyone had realized. The stakes continued for nearly half a mile before turning east, then south, then west again, encompassing a substantial tract of forest that included not just the cabin, but also Grandfather's oak, 3 Stone Crossing, and, according to her map, at least 2 more of the landmarks she needed to reach. This discovery was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it meant she might be able to follow the entire treasure trail without trespassing on someone else's land. Terrifying because it meant the property Uncle Robert was talking about selling was worth considerably more than anyone had calculated, and the potential buyer might know something about the land's true value that her family didn't understand. She calmed, walked back to the cabin, gave her time to process these implications. Someone had paid for a professional survey of property that the family considered nearly worthless. That suggested either remarkable generosity or hidden motives on the part of the prospective buyer. And the timing, coming so soon after her mother's death and her inheritance of the cabin, seemed suspiciously convenient. At the cabin, she examined the compass and map again with fresh eyes, looking for clues she might have missed during her initial excitement. That's when she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Several of the landmarks on the map lay precisely along the survey lines she'd discovered. Devil's Hollow appeared to be located near the eastern boundary, while the heart of the matter, the final destination marked with elaborate decorative flourishes, sat almost exactly in the geographic center of the surveyed property. Someone who understood the significance of this map could have used it to determine exactly which piece of land to target for purchase. The survey stakes weren't random. They were precisely placed to encompass the entire treasure trail her ancestors had marked out decades earlier. This realization filled Daisy with a mixture of determination and fear that made her hands shake. As she tucked the map back inside her jacket, she wasn't just racing against Uncle Robert's timeline for selling the property. She was competing against someone who might already know exactly what lay hidden at the heart of the matter. The urgency of the situation became even clearer that evening when Mrs. Henderson knocked on the Thompsons' door with a worried expression. Daisy overheard the adults' conversation from her bedroom, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls of the apartment above the auto shop. "I've been meaning to mention this," Mrs. Henderson said, "but I've noticed Daisy spending quite a bit of time out at the old cabin. I don't mean to intrude, but a child her age shouldn't be wandering around alone in such a remote area." Margaret's voice carried a note of irritation that Daisy had come to recognize. "We've told her repeatedly that the cabin is no place for playing. The building isn't safe, and there's no telling what kind of wild animals might be living in those woods." "Perhaps," Mrs. Henderson suggested gently, "she's trying to feel closer to her mother's family. That property has been in the Thompson line for generations, and Sarah used to tell stories about playing there as a child." Robert's voice joined the conversation. "Stories about what, exactly? Mother never mentioned the cabin to me, and I thought I knew all the family history." There was a pause before Mrs. Henderson responded, and when she did, her voice was thoughtful. "Sarah mentioned finding old papers and documents in the cabin when she was young. Family records, I believe. She seemed to think there might be important historical information stored there that future generations would want to preserve." Daisy pressed closer to her bedroom door, her heart hammering with excitement. Her mother had known about the map, or at least suspected that the cabin contained family secrets worth preserving. Mrs. Henderson's words suggested that Sarah had intended for Daisy to inherit not just the property, but also whatever knowledge it contained. But Uncle Robert's response dampened her excitement immediately. "All the more reason to clean the place out before we sell it. If there are family documents moldering away in that old building, we should retrieve them before they're completely destroyed by weather and time." "When were you planning to do that?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "This weekend, probably. Margaret and I figured we'd drive out Saturday morning and see what's worth salvaging before we finalize anything with the buyer. This weekend, 3 days from now." Daisy realized with crystal clarity that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Whatever lay hidden at the heart of the matter, whatever treasure her family had carefully concealed for future generations to discover, would soon be exposed to adult scrutiny and adult decision-making. She had 3 days to solve a mystery that had been waiting nearly a century for resolution. The next morning brought an unexpected knock on Mrs. Henderson's door, just as Daisy was walking to school. Through the apartment window, she could see the older woman answering to find a well-dressed man in an expensive-looking suit standing on her front porch. Something about the way he held himself, confident, entitled, slightly aggressive, made Daisy pause behind the curtain to listen. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Thomas Blackwell, from Blackwell Development Corporation. I believe Robert Thompson mentioned. I'm interested in purchasing his family's property on rural Route 7. Mrs. Henderson's voice was polite but cool. "I'm not sure why you'd be speaking with me about that, Mr. Blackwell. The property belongs to Robert's niece." Of course. "But I understand you've been helping to look after the child since her mother's passing. Tragic situation. I'm hoping you might help me understand the family's intentions regarding the sale." From her hiding spot, Daisy watched Mrs. Henderson's posture stiffen slightly. "The family's intentions are their own business, I'm sure." Blackwell's smile was sharp and practiced. "Naturally, I'm simply trying to expedite what I understand is a difficult situation for everyone involved. A quick sale would benefit the child tremendously. Put money aside for her education, eliminate the burden of maintaining an old property that's frankly more liability than asset." "Have you actually seen the property, Mr. Blackwell?" "Briefly. Yes, typical rural land, some forest, that old cabin that's obviously unsafe for habitation. Nothing remarkable. But I'm always looking for development opportunities in growing communities like Millfield." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of suspicion. "Development opportunities. That land is pretty remote for residential development." "Oh, I have various projects in mind. Rural retreats, hunting lodges, that sort of thing. The key is getting properties under contract quickly before word gets out and prices start rising." After Blackwell left, Daisy waited several minutes before approaching Mrs. Henderson's house. She found the older woman standing in her kitchen, staring thoughtfully out the window toward the direction of rural Route 7, a business card turning over and over in her weathered hands. "Mrs. Henderson?" Daisy's voice was small, uncertain. Something about the conversation she'd overheard had frightened her in a way she couldn't quite explain. The older woman turned, and Daisy was surprised to see worry lines etched deep around her kind eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, shouldn't you be getting to school? I heard that man talking to you about the cabin." Daisy stepped closer, drawn by the same instinct that had led her to confide in Mrs. Henderson since her mother's death. He seemed strange. Mrs. Henderson sank into one of her kitchen chairs, gesturing for Daisy to join her at the small round table where they'd shared countless cups of hot chocolate and quiet conversations. "Strange is a good word for it. Tell me, honey, has your Uncle Robert mentioned exactly how this Mr. Blackwell found out about the property being available?" Daisy shook her head. "He just said a man was interested in buying it. But Mrs. Henderson, there's something I need to tell you about the cabin, something important." The words tumbled out then, about finding the map beneath the floorboards, about the compass in the hidden drawer, about following the trail to Grandfather's Oak and Three Stone Crossing. Mrs. Henderson listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Daisy finished by describing the survey stakes and her growing suspicion that someone else knew about the treasure, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Show me," Mrs. Henderson said finally. "Show you what?" "The map, the compass, all of it." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Daisy, I think you've stumbled onto something much bigger than either of us realized, and I don't think you should be handling it alone." The relief Daisy felt at finally having someone to share her secret was overwhelming. Within minutes, they were walking together toward rural Route 7, Mrs. Henderson moving with surprising energy for someone her age. Along the way, the older woman shared memories that painted Daisy's family history in new colors. "Your great-great-grandfather Ezra was quite a character," Mrs. Henderson said as they approached the cabin. "My late husband used to tell stories about him, how he'd prospected for gold up in the mountains before settling here, how he always claimed he'd found something valuable but never said what. People thought he was just spinning tales." At the cabin, Daisy retrieved both the map and compass with hands that shook slightly with excitement and nervousness. Mrs. Henderson examined both artifacts with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "This compass belonged to Ezra. I recognize the engraving from stories my husband told, and this map," she traced the carefully drawn trail with one finger. "This isn't the work of someone's imagination. This is a genuine treasure map, drawn by someone who wanted future generations to find what he'd hidden." They spent the next hour following the trail together, with Mrs. Henderson proving surprisingly nimble as they navigated from Grandfather's Oak to Three Stone Crossing. At each landmark, the older woman examined the carved T symbols with growing amazement. "Your family has been guarding this secret for nearly a century," she said, as they stood in the clearing with the 3 granite boulders. "But I think someone else has figured it out, or at least suspects. Those survey stakes didn't appear by accident." "What do we do?" Daisy asked, clutching the compass tightly. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, studying the map's indication of the remaining landmarks. "We follow this trail to its end," she said finally, "but we do it quickly, and we do it together, because I have a feeling that Mr. Blackwell's interest in your property has nothing to do with hunting lodges." Back at Mrs. Henderson's house that evening, they spread the map on the kitchen table and planned their strategy. The older woman had produced a collection of local historical documents from her late husband's papers, land surveys, county records, and old newspaper clippings that helped fill in the gaps in the Thompson family story. According to these records, Mrs. Henderson explained, pointing to a faded newspaper article from 1924, your great-great-grandfather Ezra filed several mining claims in the mountains east of here. Most of them came to nothing, but there's a mention here of him selling a substantial quantity of gold ore to a dealer in the state capital. Daisy leaned closer to read the yellowed print. Does it say how much? Not specifically, but it mentions that he was able to purchase the cabin property outright with cash, 30 acres of prime farmland, which would have been a considerable sum in those days. Mrs. Henderson's finger moved to another document. But here's the interesting part. There's no record of him ever depositing a large sum in the local bank, and he continued to live very modestly until his death. So he hid the money? More likely he hid the source of the money. Gold was valuable then, but it was also portable and easy to conceal. If Ezra found a rich vein somewhere in those mountains, he might have brought back as much as he could carry and buried it here on his property for safekeeping. Daisy felt her pulse quicken. And somehow Mr. Blackwell knows about it. Mrs. Henderson picked up the business card the developer had left behind, turning it over to reveal handwritten notes on the back. Notes that made both of them freeze in surprise. Thompson Property, 1923 purchase, ET mining claims, probable cash location, expedite acquisition. The evidence was clear. Thomas Blackwell wasn't interested in developing the property. He was after the same treasure that Daisy's map was designed to locate. And he was working from information that suggested he understood exactly what he was looking for. We have to beat him to it, Daisy said, her young voice filled with determination that surprised even her. Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. Tomorrow, after school, we'll follow that map to its end and find out once and for all what your family has been protecting all these years. The following afternoon, Mrs. Henderson met Daisy at the school gate with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and the purposeful expression of someone embarking on serious business. They walked quickly toward rural Route 7, their conversation focused on the practical details of following the treasure map to its conclusion. "I've been thinking about those landmarks all night," Mrs. Henderson said as they approached the cabin. "Devil's Hollow and the Heart of the Matter, those aren't random names. They describe specific geographical features that would have been meaningful to someone who knew this land intimately." At the cabin, they gathered their tools, the compass, the map, bottled water, and a small folding shovel that Mrs. Henderson had brought from her garden shed. But before setting out on the trail, the older woman led Daisy to a wooden ladder that accessed the cabin's small loft area. If your great-great-grandfather was careful enough to hide a map under the floorboards and a compass in a drawer, he might have left other clues in places most people wouldn't think to look, Mrs. Henderson explained, as they climbed into the dusty space beneath the roof. The loft was cramped and filled with the detritus of decades, old furniture covered with sheets, boxes of papers that crumbled at the touch, and farming equipment that spoke of a more prosperous time. But in the far corner, wrapped in a canvas tarp that had protected it from rain leaking through the deteriorating roof, they found a wooden chest about the size of a suitcase. Inside the chest, beneath layers of moth-eaten blankets, lay a leather-bound journal filled with entries in the same flowing script they'd seen on the map. The journal's pages were yellow with age, but the ink remained clear enough to read by the afternoon light filtering through the loft's small window. May 15th, 1923, Mrs. Henderson read aloud from the first entry. "Today, I have taken possession of the 30 acres on rural Route 7. The land is good, with clear water and rich soil, but more importantly, it provides the perfect location for keeping safe the fruits of my labor in the mountains. What the earth has given, the earth shall preserve." Daisy leaned closer as Mrs. Henderson continued reading through the journal's entries. They painted a picture of Ezra Thompson as a methodical man who had indeed discovered a rich vein of gold in the mountains east of Millfield. But rather than trying to mine it commercially, which would have required registering claims and paying taxes, he had extracted what he could carry personally and buried it on his new property for future generations. June 3rd, 1923, Mrs. Henderson read. The cache is now complete. 17 pounds of pure ore, plus the jewelry and coins from previous expeditions. The location is marked according to the old ways with signs that only family will understand. The map is hidden where Sarah's children will find it when the time comes. Sarah's children, Daisy whispered. He knew my mother would inherit the cabin. Mrs. Henderson flipped through more pages, finding increasingly specific details about the treasure's location and value. Listen to this entry from August. Today's assay confirms the ore's purity at better than 90%. Conservative estimates place the cache's value at sufficient to purchase half the county, should future generations require such resources. The journal's final entries detailed the creation of the map and the placement of landmarks designed to guide family members to the treasure's location. But the most revealing passage came near the end of the journal, in an entry dated October 1923. Word has reached me that others in the territory have taken note of my mountain expeditions. A man calling himself Blackwell has been asking questions about my activities and the location of my claims. I have therefore accelerated my timeline for securing the cache. Let future generations know that what appears to be worthless land contains enough wealth to secure their independence for many lifetimes. Mrs. Henderson looked up from the journal with wide eyes. Blackwell, that's the same name as the developer who's been pressuring your uncle to sell. The same family. Could be a descendant, or it could be the same name passed down through generations of people who've been hunting for Ezra's treasure. Mrs. Henderson closed the journal carefully. Either way, it confirms what we already suspected. Mr. Blackwell knows exactly what he's looking for. Armed with the additional information from the journal, they set out on the trail with new understanding of their mission's importance. The journal had provided more detailed descriptions of the landmarks, making navigation significantly easier. Devil's Hollow, according to Ezra's notes, was a natural depression in the land where 3 streams converged, creating a distinctive bowl-shaped valley that early settlers had associated with supernatural activity. Following the compass and map, from 3 Stone Crossing, they hiked steadily eastward through increasingly dense forest. The terrain was challenging, with the land rising and falling in steep ridges that required careful navigation. But after nearly an hour of determined walking, they heard the sound of running water ahead. Not just one stream, but multiple watercourses, converging in what sounded like a small waterfall. Devil's Hollow proved to be exactly as the journal had described, a natural amphitheater carved into the landscape by centuries of flowing water. 3 streams tumbled down from different directions, meeting in a rocky pool before continuing eastward as a single creek. The hollow was surrounded by towering trees that created a cathedral-like atmosphere, and carved into a prominent boulder at the water's edge was the familiar T in a circle. But more importantly, consulting the map and compass from this vantage point revealed the final destination clearly. The heart of the matter lay due south of the hollow, approximately a quarter-mile through the forest, at what the map indicated was the highest point on the property. The hike to the final landmark took them up a gradual slope that grew steeper. As they climbed, the forest here was older and more pristine than anywhere they'd explored, with massive oaks and maples that had clearly been growing for well over a century. And at the crest of the hill, in a circular clearing that commanded views of the entire surrounding valley, they found a formation of stones that took their breath away. Someone, almost certainly Ezra Thompson, had arranged a circle of large rocks around the base of an enormous oak tree. The tree itself was ancient, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter and its branches spreading out like the arms of a protective giant. And carved deep into the bark, much larger and more elaborate than the simple marks they'd found at other landmarks, was an intricate design that incorporated the T symbol with decorative flourishes that matched the ornamentation on the map. "This is it," Mrs. Henderson breathed, studying the clearing with the eye of someone who understood the significance of what they'd found. The heart of the matter. This is where Ezra hid his treasure. According to the map, the cache lay 7 paces south of the great oak's heart, beneath the stone that bears the double mark. They found the marked stone easily, a flat granite slab about 3 feet square, with 2 T symbols carved side by side. But moving the stone would require more strength than either of them possessed. As they stood in the clearing, contemplating the practical challenges of excavating what might be a substantial treasure, the sound of voices carried through the forest. From the direction they'd come, male voices growing closer, speaking in the confident tones of people who knew exactly where they were going. Mrs. Henderson grabbed Daisy's hand. "We need to hide. Now." They barely had time to conceal themselves behind a fallen log at the edge of the clearing before 3 men emerged from the forest. Thomas Blackwell led the group, consulting what appeared to be a copy of the same map Daisy carried, while behind him walked Uncle Robert and a 3rd man, carrying surveying equipment and metal detectors. "This should be the location," Blackwell said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness of the clearing. According to the documentation, the cache is buried beneath the marked stone near the base of the large oak. Daisy felt Mrs. Henderson's hand tighten on her arm as they watched Uncle Robert approach the very stone they'd been examining moments before. Her uncle's betrayal cut deeper than she'd imagined possible. Not just the fact that he was working with Blackwell, but the casual way he discussed selling away her birthright as if it meant nothing at all. "I still don't understand how you obtained a copy of the original map," Robert said, kneeling beside the marked stone. "The family never mentioned anything about treasure maps or hidden gold." Blackwell's smile was cold and calculating. "Let's just say that certain historical documents occasionally find their way into private collections. My family has been researching Ezra Thompson's activities for nearly a century. We knew he'd found gold in those mountains, and we knew he'd hidden it somewhere on this property." The 3rd man, introduced as Peterson, but clearly more security than surveyor, began setting up a metal detector while Blackwell and Robert worked together to pry up the marked stone. Beneath it, exactly as the map had indicated, was a rectangular pit carved into the underlying rock. But the pit was empty. Blackwell's confident expression faltered as he stared into the hollow space where a treasure chest should have been waiting. "This isn't possible. The documentation was specific about the location." "Maybe someone already found it," Robert suggested, though his voice carried disappointment rather than genuine surprise. "No!" Blackwell's voice was sharp with frustration. "There's been no record of anyone accessing this property for decades. The treasure has to be here. We're just looking in the wrong place." Peterson's metal detector began producing electronic squeaks and beeps as he swept it across the clearing. The device's enthusiasm increased dramatically as he approached a section of ground about 20 feet south of the oak tree, in an area that looked completely unremarkable to the casual observer. "Got something here," Peterson announced. "Strong signal, about 3 feet down, something big." From their hiding place, Daisy and Mrs. Henderson watched as the 3 men began digging with professional efficiency. It quickly became clear that this wasn't their first treasure hunting expedition. They worked with the coordination of people who'd done this before, with Peterson operating the metal detector while Blackwell and Robert took turns with shovels. "I have to ask," Robert said during a brief rest, "what exactly is my cut of whatever we find? We agreed on terms for selling you the property, but you never specified how the treasure would be divided." Blackwell's laugh was unpleasant. "Robert, my friend, you seem to be operating under a misapprehension. Once I've purchased the property from you at the agreed-upon price for worthless farmland, anything found on that property becomes mine. That's how property ownership works. But I said I'd pay you a fair price for rural land, and I will. The fact that the land happens to contain something valuable doesn't change our agreement." Blackwell's voice took on a threatening edge. "Unless, of course, you're thinking of renegotiating our deal." Uncle Robert's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but Peterson's sudden shout interrupted the growing tension between the two men. "Found it!" The metal detector had led them to a spot where the ground showed subtle signs of having been disturbed decades earlier. 3 feet down, Peterson's shovel struck something solid, something wooden that gave off the unmistakable sound of a treasure chest. Working together, the 3 men excavated a rectangular wooden box, clearly handmade and bound with iron straps, that had resisted decades of burial. The chest was larger than Daisy had expected, about the size of a small trunk, and heavy enough to require all 3 men to lift it from the hole. Blackwell produced a small crowbar from his equipment bag and pried open the chest's ancient lock. Even from their hiding place, Daisy and Mrs. Henderson could see the gleam of gold coins and what appeared to be rough-cut gemstones reflecting the afternoon sunlight. The treasure was real, substantial, and clearly worth a fortune. Magnificent, Blackwell breathed, lifting a handful of gold coins from the chest. Absolutely magnificent. Ezra Thompson was even more successful than our research indicated, but as he examined the treasure more carefully, his expression grew puzzled. Reaching deeper into the chest, he pulled out a folded document that had been placed on top of the gold and jewels. Unfolding it revealed a piece of paper covered in the same flowing script they'd seen in Ezra's journal. "What does it say?" Robert asked impatiently. Blackwell read aloud, his voice growing increasingly tense with each word. "To whomever finds this cash through greed rather than birthright, you hold in your hands the life's work of an honest man, hidden for the benefit of his descendants. But know that this treasure comes with a curse for those who would steal from children and widows. The true wealth of this land lies not in gold, but in the legal documents contained within this chest. Documents that will ensure the Thompson family's rightful ownership for generations to come." "Legal documents?" Robert snatched the paper from Blackwell's hands. "What kind of legal documents?" From the bottom of the chest, Blackwell lifted a metal box that had been sealed with wax. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were several official-looking papers bearing official seals and ribbons. As he read through them, his face grew progressively paler. "Mineral rights," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ezra Thompson filed mineral rights claims on this entire property and the surrounding area. Claims that remain valid to this day, transferring automatically to his heirs." "What does that mean?" Robert demanded. "It means," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping out from behind the fallen log with Daisy beside her, "that the gold these men have just stolen belongs legally to Daisy, not to whoever happens to be standing on the property when they find it." The 3 men spun around in shock, clearly not expecting to find witnesses to their treasure-hunting expedition. Blackwell's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but Mrs. Henderson's calm voice stopped him. "I wouldn't recommend doing anything foolish, Mr. Blackwell. Sheriff Morrison is expecting us back in town within the hour, and he knows exactly where we've gone and why." She gestured toward Daisy, who was holding up a small digital camera. "Besides, we've documented your entire conversation about defrauding a 6-year-old girl out of her inheritance." Blackwell's confident facade cracked completely. "You don't understand the situation here. That treasure represents years of research, years of investment in tracking down historical documents, years of planning to rob a child," Mrs. Henderson corrected firmly. "The mineral rights documents in that chest prove that every ounce of gold on this property belongs to Daisy Thompson, regardless of who digs it up. Your research may have led you to the treasure, but it also led you to commit several felonies in front of witnesses." Uncle Robert looked between Blackwell and his niece with growing panic. "Daisy, sweetheart, you have to understand. I was trying to do what was best for the family. Mr. Blackwell offered good money for worthless land, and I thought you'd sell my inheritance to a treasure hunter without telling me what it was really worth," Daisy said, her young voice carrying a dignity that made Robert flush with shame. "Now, Mrs. Henderson continued, "Mr. Blackwell and his associate are going to carefully return every coin, every jewel, and every document to that chest. Then they're going to carry it back to the cabin, where we'll be meeting Sheriff Morrison, to discuss attempted fraud, trespassing, and theft of mineral rights." Blackwell started to protest, but the sound of approaching voices through the forest, official voices calling out in the measured tones of law enforcement, convinced him that cooperation was his wisest option. The true betrayal, Daisy realized, as she watched her uncle reluctantly help repack the treasure chest, wasn't just that Robert had tried to sell her property. It was that he'd been willing to do it without ever bothering to discover what that property might mean to her, what secrets it might hold, what legacy her mother had intended to pass down. But standing in the clearing with Mrs. Henderson's protective hand on her shoulder and a century's worth of family treasure at her feet, Daisy understood that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what people leave you. It's what you discover about yourself in the process of fighting to keep it. The walk back to the cabin felt like a parade of justice in slow motion. Sheriff Morrison and his deputy had indeed been waiting at the property line, having been contacted by Mrs. Henderson earlier that afternoon when she'd grown suspicious of Uncle Robert's sudden urgency about cleaning out the cabin. The sight of 3 men carrying a treasure chest through the forest, followed by a determined elderly woman and a 6-year-old girl, was not what law enforcement had expected to encounter on what they'd assumed would be a routine property dispute call. "Mrs. Henderson," Sheriff Morrison said, his weathered face creased with bewilderment, "when you called about suspicious activity on the Thompson property, you didn't mention anything about treasure chests. We weren't entirely certain what we'd find," Mrs. Henderson replied diplomatically. "But we knew that Mr. Blackwell's interest in the property went beyond simple land development." At the cabin, under the sheriff's watchful eye, the entire treasure chest was emptied and catalogued. The gold coins alone filled 2 evidence bags, their weight and obvious purity making even the law enforcement officers whistle with amazement. The rough-cut gemstones, emeralds, sapphires, and what appeared to be several substantial diamonds added another layer of value that would require professional appraisal to quantify. But the most significant discovery was the collection of legal documents that Ezra Thompson had sealed within the metal box. Beyond the mineral rights papers, there were property deeds extending the Thompson holdings much farther than anyone had realized. Survey maps detailing underground water rights, and, most remarkably, a last will and testament that specifically bequeathed the hidden treasure to the youngest Thompson heir of the 4th generation, when she shall have reached the age of understanding and demonstrated the wisdom to seek what others overlook. The youngest Thompson heir of the 4th generation, Sheriff Morrison read aloud. "That would be you, Miss Daisy, and it seems like you've definitely demonstrated the wisdom to seek what others overlooked." Thomas Blackwell stood in handcuffs beside his associate Peterson, both men facing charges of trespassing, attempted theft, and conspiracy to defraud a minor. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely as the legal implications of their failed treasure hunt became clear. "This is ridiculous," he protested to Sheriff Morrison. "We had a legitimate business agreement with the girl's guardian to purchase the property. We were within our rights to conduct a preliminary survey with metal detectors and shovels," the sheriff asked dryly. "Mr. Blackwell, preliminary surveys don't typically involve excavating treasure chests without the property owner's knowledge or consent." Uncle Robert stood apart from the other men, his face a mixture of shame and confusion as he watched his niece take legal possession of what was clearly a substantial fortune. The mineral rights documents alone were worth more than he'd make in a lifetime of auto repair, and the gold and jewels represented generational wealth that would secure Daisy's future beyond anything he could have imagined. "I didn't know," he said quietly to Mrs. Henderson as the sheriff completed his paperwork. "I swear I had no idea the property contained anything valuable. Blackwell told me he was interested in rural development, and the money he offered seemed like a good opportunity. For Daisy's education fund, Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. Robert, your intentions may have been good, but you were ready to sell your niece's inheritance without ever bothering to explore what that inheritance might contain. That speaks to a lack of curiosity about your own family history that's frankly troubling. As the afternoon shadows lengthened around the cabin, the full scope of Daisy's inheritance began to come into focus. The mineral rights documents established her ownership of gold and silver deposits throughout a substantial area of the surrounding mountains. The property deeds revealed that the Thompson holdings included not just the 30 acres around the cabin, but also water rights, timber rights, and easements that extended her family's influence across much of the local countryside. But perhaps most importantly, a careful reading of Ezra Thompson's will revealed that the treasure had been deliberately hidden as a test of character for future generations. The gold and jewels were intended not just as wealth, but as a means of ensuring that Thompson descendants would have the resources to maintain their independence and protect the land that had been placed in their care. Your great-great-grandfather was a remarkably forward-thinking man, Mrs. Henderson observed as they examined the will by lamplight inside the cabin. He understood that preserving this land and its resources would require more than just legal documents. It would require descendants who cared enough to seek out the family's secrets and fight to protect them. Sheriff Morrison finished his investigation just as darkness began to fall over the forest. Blackwell and Peterson were taken into custody, while Uncle Robert was released with instructions to appear for questioning the following week. The treasure chest and its contents were temporarily secured in the county vault, pending legal resolution of Daisy's ownership claims, though the sheriff made it clear that the documentary evidence strongly supported her rights to everything that had been discovered. "One thing I don't understand," Sheriff Morrison said as he prepared to leave, "is how you knew to start looking for a treasure in the first place. Most 6-year-olds don't typically go hunting for buried gold with metal detectors." Daisy looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded encouragingly. From her jacket pocket, she withdrew the original map that had started the entire adventure, carefully unfolding it in the lamplight for the sheriff to examine. "I found this hidden under the floorboards," she explained. "My mother's locket led me to it, and then I found my great-great-grandfather's compass, and everything just started to make sense." Sheriff Morrison studied the map with the eye of someone who'd spent decades investigating mysteries much less exotic than treasure hunts. "This is remarkable workmanship," he said finally. "Hand-drawn, obviously old and incredibly detailed. Your ancestor put a lot of thought into making sure future generations could follow his trail. But only," Mrs. Henderson added pointedly, "if those future generations cared enough to look beyond the surface of what they'd inherited. The map was hidden in a place where only someone who truly valued the cabin would think to explore." As the law enforcement vehicles disappeared down rural Route 7, taking with them the men who tried to steal her inheritance, Daisy stood with Mrs. Henderson in the clearing outside the cabin. The night air was crisp with the promise of changing seasons, and overhead stars were beginning to emerge in a sky that seemed wider and more full of possibility than ever before. "What happens now?" Daisy asked, suddenly feeling the weight of responsibility that came with discovering she was the heir to a fortune. Mrs. Henderson put her arm around the girl's shoulders, her touch warm and reassuring in the darkness. "Now we make sure that everything your great-great-grandfather worked to preserve stays in the family where it belongs. The legal paperwork will take some time to sort out, but there's no question about your rights to the treasure and the property." "I mean about living arrangements," Daisy clarified. "Uncle Robert was supposed to be my guardian, but after what happened today, Mrs. Henderson said gently, "I think it's clear that you need someone who understands the value of family history and the importance of protecting what previous generations worked to build." If you'd like, I'd be honored to serve as your legal guardian until you're old enough to manage your inheritance independently." The offer filled Daisy with a relief so profound that she felt tears spring to her eyes. Mrs. Henderson had been more than a neighbor since her mother's death. She'd been the one constant source of support and understanding in a world that had suddenly become much more complicated than any 6-year-old should have to navigate. "I'd like that very much," Daisy said, her voice thick with emotion. Standing together in the starlight beside the cabin that had started as a burden and revealed itself as a treasure beyond imagining, they began making plans for a future that suddenly held possibilities neither of them could have dreamed just weeks before. The treasure chest might be locked away in the county vault, but its discovery had unlocked something far more valuable. The knowledge that sometimes the greatest inheritances are the ones that require courage, wisdom, and persistence to claim. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, appraisers, and the complex process of legally establishing Daisy's rights to a fortune that had been waiting nearly a century for the right person to discover it. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness surrounding her family's cabin, she understood that the most important treasure she'd found wasn't gold or jewels. It was the knowledge that she was part of a family legacy worth fighting to protect, and that she'd found an ally willing to help her carry that responsibility into the future. The formal appraisal of Ezra Thompson's treasure took place 3 weeks later in the conference room of the First National Bank of Millfield, under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Morrison, the county prosecutor, and a team of specialists brought in from the state capitol. Daisy sat between Mrs. Henderson and the family attorney they'd hired, a kind woman named Patricia Wells, who specialized in inheritance law and had expressed amazement at the complexity of the case. The treasure chest itself sat on the conference table like something from a pirate story, its weathered wood and iron bindings, speaking of an age when people buried their wealth rather than trusting it to banks. But the real drama came when the contents were formally catalogued and appraised by certified experts. "The gold coins," announced the numismatist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd been examining each piece with a jeweler's loupe, represent a collection spanning approximately 30 years, from 1890 to 1923. Most are American eagles in various denominations, but there are also some extremely rare territorial coins from Colorado and California that significantly increase the collection's value. He consulted his notes with the precision of someone accustomed to dealing with valuable antiquities. Conservative. Auction estimate for the coin collection alone would be approximately $800,000, though certain individual pieces could command substantially higher prices from serious collectors. Mrs. Henderson squeezed Daisy's hand as the gemologist, a professional woman with silver hair and steady hands, presented her findings about the rough-cut stones. "The gemstones show clear evidence of having been mined rather than purchased," she explained. "The emeralds are particularly fine specimens, likely from deposits in the Colorado mountains, while the sapphires appear to be from Montana sources. The diamonds—" She paused dramatically. "The diamonds are exceptional. 3 stones of substantial size and remarkable clarity that would have been worth a fortune even in 1923. Could you provide a current market estimate?" Attorney Wells asked. The gemologist smiled. "For the entire collection of stones, assuming they were cut and set professionally, we're looking at approximately $12 million. Possibly more, depending on the final quality grades after professional cutting." Daisy felt the room spin slightly around her. $12 million. The number was so large it seemed almost meaningless, like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. But the final revelation came when the historical documents expert, a professor from the state university, presented his analysis of the legal papers that had been sealed in the metal box. These mineral rights documents, he announced, establish the Thompson family's ownership of mining claims across approximately 15 square miles of mountain territory, based on geological surveys conducted in the area over the past century. These claims likely contain gold deposits worth... He paused, consulting a thick folder of technical reports. Conservative estimates suggest potential mineral wealth in excess of $175 million. The conference room fell silent as the magnitude of Daisy's inheritance became clear. The treasure chest had contained not just the fruits of Ezra Thompson's mining expeditions, but also the legal foundation for claiming mineral wealth that dwarfed even the most optimistic estimates. Combined with the current market value of the gold coins, gemstones, and the developed property itself, Attorney Wells said slowly, we're looking at an inheritance worth approximately $200 million. Sheriff Morrison let out a low whistle. That puts a different perspective on Mr. Blackwell's interest in purchasing the property for development purposes. Mrs. Henderson's voice was steady, but filled with wonder. Ezra Thompson wasn't just hiding a treasure. He was preserving a fortune for his descendants. All of this was waiting for someone in the family who cared enough to look beyond the surface of what they'd inherited. As the formal proceedings concluded and the various experts packed up their equipment, Daisy found herself staring at the treasure chest that had transformed her from a poor orphan into one of the wealthiest children in the state. But the gold and jewels seemed less important now than the knowledge that she was part of a family legacy that stretched back through generations of people who had worked, planned, and sacrificed to preserve something precious for the future. "What do we do now?" she asked Mrs. Henderson as the conference room emptied around them. "Now," the older woman said with a smile, "we make sure that all of this wealth is used in ways that would make your ancestors proud. Your great-great-grandfather didn't hide this treasure so that future generations could simply spend it. He preserved it so that the Thompson family would always have the resources to protect what matters most." The treasure chest was returned to the bank vault pending final legal resolution. But Daisy walked out of the First National Bank of Millfield knowing that her life had been transformed in ways that went far beyond material wealth. She was no longer just a little girl who'd inherited a falling-down cabin. She was the guardian of a family legacy worth fighting to preserve, and she'd found the perfect ally to help her shoulder that responsibility. The legal aftermath of the treasure discovery moved with surprising speed through the county court system. Thomas Blackwell's attempt to contest Daisy's ownership of the treasure collapsed when investigators discovered that his historical research had included breaking into the county records office to photograph confidential mining documents. His family's century-long obsession with finding Ezra Thompson's gold had crossed the line from persistent research into criminal activity. 2 months after the discovery, Daisy sat in the same courthouse where her mother's will had been read. But this time, the proceedings were focused on securing her rights rather than determining her fate. Judge Harrison, a dignified woman in her 60s who'd presided over the county court for 20 years, reviewed the final legal documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood the case's significance. "Mr. Blackwell," Judge Harrison said, addressing the defendant who sat in handcuffs between his attorney and a bailiff, "you've pled guilty to charges of criminal trespass, attempted theft, and conspiracy to defraud a minor. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say to Miss Thompson?" Blackwell looked across the courtroom at Daisy, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose life's work had crumbled into disgrace. "I spent 40 years researching your family's history," he said quietly. 40 years trying to solve a mystery that my grandfather passed down to me. I never intended to hurt a child. I thought I was claiming something that belonged to no one. But it did belong to someone, Daisy replied, her young voice carrying surprising authority in the formal courtroom setting. It belonged to my family, and it was hidden for me to find when I was ready to take care of it. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Mr. Blackwell, your research efforts might have been admirable if they'd remained within legal boundaries. However, your decision to engage in criminal activity in pursuit of someone else's inheritance demonstrates a fundamental disrespect for property rights and child welfare. I sentence you to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation and full restitution for legal expenses incurred by the Thompson estate. The resolution of Uncle Robert's role in the affair proved more complex and emotionally challenging. He'd cooperated fully with investigators, providing evidence about Blackwell's initial approach and the financial incentives he'd been offered for facilitating the property sale. But his willingness to sell Daisy's inheritance without exploring its significance had damaged their family relationship in ways that legal proceedings couldn't address. "I know I can't undo what I tried to do," Robert said during a private meeting with Daisy and Mrs. Henderson after the court proceedings concluded. "I was thinking about immediate problems. How to pay for your care. How to manage property I didn't understand. I never imagined that the cabin could contain anything valuable." Mrs. Henderson's response was measured but firm. "Robert, the issue isn't that you couldn't have known about the treasure. The issue is that you were ready to dispose of Daisy's inheritance without ever bothering to explore what it might mean to her, what family history it might contain, what her mother might have intended by leaving it to her." "I want to make it right," Robert said, his voice thick with regret. "I know I can't be her guardian anymore. I don't deserve that responsibility. But I want to be part of her life if she'll let me." Daisy considered his words carefully. At 6 years old, she was learning lessons about forgiveness and family loyalty that many adults never mastered. "You can visit sometimes," she said finally, "but Mrs. Henderson is my family now. She's the one who helped me find what Mom left for me." The formal transfer of legal guardianship to Mrs. Henderson took place in Judge Harrison's chambers, a quiet ceremony that felt more like a family celebration than a legal proceeding. The paperwork was straightforward. Mrs. Henderson had already passed all required background checks and home inspections, but the emotional significance of the moment filled the small room with warmth. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Harrison said, as she signed the final documents, "you're assuming responsibility for a very wealthy young lady. Are you prepared for the challenges that will come with managing such a substantial inheritance?" "Your Honor," Mrs. Henderson replied with a gentle smile, "I've been preparing for this responsibility my entire life. Daisy needs someone who understands. The true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the wisdom to preserve what previous generations worked to build." As they left the courthouse together, Daisy felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal victories or financial security. The treasure hunt that had begun with a rusty key and a hidden map had led her not just to gold and jewels, but to the family bonds that would sustain her for the rest of her life. "What do we do now?" she asked Mrs. Henderson as they walked down the courthouse steps into the warm afternoon sunshine. "Now," Mrs. Henderson said, taking her hand, "we go home and start planning how to use your inheritance to honor your family's legacy and build something beautiful for the future." 6 months after the treasure discovery, the old Thompson cabin had been transformed from a crumbling relic into a beautiful family home that honored both its history and its future. Professional contractors had restored the log walls and installed a new roof, while careful attention to historical accuracy ensured that the building retained its original character. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards had been preserved as a reminder of the adventure that changed everything. And Ezra Thompson's compass was displayed in a place of honor above the restored stone fireplace. Daisy stood in the cabin's main room on a crisp October morning, watching Mrs. Henderson prepare breakfast in the small but modern kitchen they'd added to the back of the building. The contrast between her current life and the uncertain months immediately following her mother's death felt like comparing different centuries rather than different seasons of the same year. "The attorney called this morning, Mrs. Henderson," said, flipping pancakes with the practiced ease of someone who'd been making breakfast for loved ones for decades. "The final mineral rights paperwork has been approved by the state. You now officially own mining claims worth more than most people see in several lifetimes." But Daisy had learned that knowing about wealth and feeling wealthy were entirely different experiences. The treasure had provided security and opportunity, but the day-to-day reality of her life revolved around simpler pleasures: helping Mrs. Henderson tend the garden they'd planted around the cabin, exploring the forest trails that connected her property to the wider world, and attending the small rural school where she'd made friends who knew her as Daisy rather than as the girl who found the treasure. The restoration of the cabin had been only the beginning of their plans for the Thompson inheritance. Working with attorneys and financial advisors, they'd established a foundation dedicated to preserving rural family histories and helping children who found themselves orphaned or displaced by circumstances beyond their control. The foundation's offices occupied a renovated building on Millfield's Main Street, and its programs had already begun making a difference in lives throughout the county. "Mrs. Peterson from the foundation called too," Mrs. Henderson continued, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Daisy. "3 more families have applied for assistance with genealogical research, and the scholarship program has received applications from 12 children who want to attend college but lack the financial resources." This was the part of her inheritance that gave Daisy the most satisfaction: the knowledge that Ezra Thompson's carefully preserved wealth was being used to help other families preserve their own histories and build their own futures. The foundation had funded the restoration of several historical buildings in Millfield, established a library dedicated to local family records, and created programs that taught children to value their heritage while preparing for their futures. The sound of a car approaching on the gravel drive interrupted their breakfast conversation. Through the window, Daisy could see Uncle Robert climbing out of his pickup truck, carrying what appeared to be a wrapped gift, and wearing the nervous expression of someone still learning how to rebuild a damaged relationship. His visits had become monthly traditions, careful, respectful occasions where he worked to demonstrate that he understood the magnitude of his earlier betrayal while slowly earning his way back into Daisy's trust. The process was delicate, requiring patience from everyone involved, but it had gradually yielded genuine moments of family connection. "I brought something I thought you should have," Robert said after they'd settled in the living room with hot chocolate and the kind of careful conversation that characterized their healing relationship. The wrapped package contained a photograph album that Daisy had never seen before, dozens of pictures spanning several generations of Thompson family history. "These were your grandmothers," Robert explained, opening the album to reveal faded black and white photographs of people whose faces carried the same determined expression Daisy saw in her own mirror. "I found them in Mother's attic last week." She'd saved pictures going all the way back to Ezra and his wife Martha. The photographs brought the family history to life in ways that legal documents and treasure maps never could. Here was Ezra Thompson as a young man, standing beside the partially constructed cabin with Martha and their children. Here were images of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments that captured the daily life of people who'd worked to build something lasting for future generations. "This one," Robert said, pointing to a photograph near the back of the album, "is your mother when she was about your age. She's standing right here in front of the cabin, holding what looks like that same compass you found." The photograph showed Sarah Thompson as a child, her face bright with curiosity and determination as she examined the brass compass in her small hands. The image created a direct connection across time. 4 generations of Thompson women who'd found meaning and purpose in preserving their family's legacy. "She knew," Daisy said softly, studying her mother's young face in the faded photograph. "She knew about the treasure, about the map, about all of it." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "She knew, and she made sure you'd find it when you were ready. The locket, the placement of the map, even choosing to leave you the cabin despite its apparent condition, all of that was carefully planned to guide you to your inheritance when you were old enough to handle the responsibility. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, illuminating the photographs that chronicled her family's history, Daisy understood that the treasure she'd inherited went far beyond gold and jewels. She'd inherited a tradition of perseverance, a commitment to preserving what mattered most, and the knowledge that sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that require courage and wisdom to claim. Outside the cabin windows, the forest that had hidden her family's secrets for nearly a century spread out in autumn colors that spoke of change, renewal, and the endless cycle of seasons that connected past to future. And somewhere in those woods, marked by stones and remembered in maps, lay the physical evidence of what people could accomplish when they worked not just for themselves, but for generations they would never meet. The little girl who'd once been mocked for inheriting a worthless cabin had discovered that the most precious inheritances are often the ones that others overlook, and that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all.